Coming up next, CityNet 30 takes you downtown for the weekly luncheon meeting of the City Club of Portland. Live weekly coverage of City Club is made possible in part by TCI and is produced through the facilities of Portland Cable Access. Now we join the City Club for this week's program.
Good afternoon. I'm Andy Linehan, member of the Board of Governors of City Club. I'm taking the place of President Lloyd Anderson, who's out of town today. Welcome to the City Club and another special program. Today we're focusing on global sustainable development and transnational pollution with Elaine Cogan, who has recently studied the issue in Thailand, and our special guest, James C. Martin, who's the Regional Environmental Affairs Officer for the Asia-Pacific region for the U.S. Embassy in Bangkok. Next Friday, July 2nd, there'll be no program. Enjoy your 4th of July weekend. The following Friday, July 9th, join us for a program with Congressman Earl Blumenauer, who will be with us to discuss community livability. We will also have the presentation of our Arts and Culture Committee's information report that day, so the program will begin promptly at noon here at the Multnomah Athletic Club. Our board host today, seated at the head table, is Sharon Brabenak. She's a member of the Board of Governors, and she's the Alumni and Donor Relations Manager for Marylhurst University. She'll ask the first question of our speakers. Following Sharon's question, we will open the program to questions from other City Club members in the audience. Please line up behind the microphone before Sharon is finished so that we can avoid any lag between questions and so that we have time to ask as many questions as people would like. Please identify yourselves as City Club members and ask your question, and of course, please limit your question to 30 seconds. Broadcast of City Club programs this quarter is made possible in part because of corporate underwriting from CH2M Hill, Weyerhaeuser, and Pacific Care of Oregon. We're grateful for their support. During the heady days of double-digit growth in Asian economies, murmurs of concern for the impacts to the region's environmental resources were really overwhelmed by cheers for the region's unparalleled economic expansion. The economic recession of the last year or two has given some countries an opportunity to reflect on the consequences of rapid growth to the region's air, land, water, and ecosystem resources. Many of us observing Asia from overseas wonder whether this pause to reflect will lead to new, more sustainable patterns of development or simply more of the same. Our speakers today bring personal and professional experience and interest in the challenge of sustainable development. Elaine Cogan is a principal with Cogan Owens Cogan. Her distinguished career has focused on facilitating public processes to address controversial public policy issues. During a recent United States Information Service-sponsored speaking engagement in Southeast Asia, she met James C. Martin in Bangkok. Mr. Martin joined the Foreign Service in 1985 and has since been posted to Kenya, Sudan, Uganda, Malawi, and Uzbekistan. Since 1997, he has been the State Department's first Regional Environmental Affairs Officer for Southeast Asia, based at the U.S. Embassy in Bangkok. Elaine Cogan will open our program and establish the context for the discussion by sharing insights based on her recent trip to Southeast Asia. Mr. Martin will follow Elaine Cogan with his summary of the current status of environmental protection in Southeast Asia and his assessment of the prospects for a more sustainable path to development.
Thank you. And we will leave the expert observations and information to Jim, and I appreciate Andy telling you that I will try to give you some context from a 10-day trip, which makes me an instant expert, as we all know. Terry O'Donnell, one of our wonderful historians in Portland, has written a new book in which he has characterized the three Western cities. He says that San Francisco is a debutante, Seattle is a tart, and Portland is the spinster. Well, I don't know about the other two, but I'm very proud of being called a spinster, an old maid, however you want to call it. Because each of us, I'm sure, in our backgrounds has at least one maiden aunt, one wonderful, quote, old maid, unquote, school teacher, people who have made a real difference in our lives because they gave so much of themselves. Well, unofficially, we are that too, because like it or not, people look to Portland and people look to Oregon for guidance. They think we know the answers to a lot more questions than we know we don't know. As Andy said, Arnold Cogan, my partner and husband, and Bob Wise, who is a senior associate with us at Cogan Owens Cogan, and also chair of the Sustainable Portland Commission, were guests of the State Department for 10 days in March and April. We were asked to talk to various groups throughout the country of Thailand, and actually 2 cities, in Bangkok and in Chiang Mai, a city which is in the north and called the Rose of the North. And we were very anxious to see that city. It has about a little over 1 million people, whereas Bangkok is 10 million and teeming Southeast Asian city. Our subject was healthy cities and healthy states, in effect, because Arnold did, as many of you know, as the father of land use in Oregon, was able to bring those experiences also to our discussion. And we spent a lot of time talking about public involvement and found out that that's very different in Thailand than it is in the United States. And so we were speaking with the people on environmental issues, on political issues, on land use issues. As many of you may know, Thailand is the only democracy in Southeast Asia, and it has a king, it has a monarchy, a much beloved king who spends a good deal of his time traveling the countryside, mostly in the rural areas, helping out the rural economy with grants and with assistance. He spends less time in the cities, and as people who are concerned with urban problems, that was very interesting for us to learn. There's little local control despite the democracy, there's little local control over land use planning or planning of any kind and zoning. And this became manifest to us as our guides and hosts took us around. For example, we saw a Buddhist temple, a lovely old Buddhist temple, right next door to a huge high-rise. And they pointed that out as one of the bad examples of where somebody had been able to circumvent the land use and zoning law. However, that high-rise is empty. And it's empty because the Buddhist community got very angry at the fact that they did that. They couldn't do anything about the actual erection of the building, but they circled it and they put a curse on it. And nobody has rented in that building, which is something for us to think about too. The people do what they can, I guess is the example that is. However, we saw a wonderful palace converted to a prison in an area where we're in a state where we're building prisons. I'm not sure that even the legislature would approve of that one. We saw heavy industry next to residences. The mixture from our hotel room in Bangkok was unbelievable. On one hand, we saw another temple, and they are all over, but we also saw McDonald's, a Planet Hollywood, Starbucks, and a 7-Eleven, and there are 1,000 7-Elevens in Thailand. We saw pollution. We saw pollution in the guise of people walking along the streets with face masks. We saw waterways and canals that had been, again, teeming with fish and swimmable that were no longer that. In Chiang Mai, we pointed out that they have a garbage problem. They have so much of a garbage problem that they have deposed 2 mayors in 18 months because basically they can't find a site for a landfill. And the last solution was to cart it out in the dead of night as far away as they could from the city. Well, you can only do that so long, and so they were working on their 3rd mayor. Whom did we meet with in this time? And I might say if we had wanted to be tourists, we weren't given the chance because they worked us very hard as guests of the U.S. Information Service. We met with academics, with students, architects, historians, political activists. We showed them slides of Portland and of the state. We answered their questions. But we were very careful not to prescribe, not to be the ugly know-it-all American. We wanted to learn from them as well as to give them the basis of our experience. And I might say that I have nothing but the highest kudos to the U.S. Information Service and the State Department, because while they sponsored the entire trip and took us everywhere we needed to go, they were then became invisible. They sat in the back, they quietly absorbed what needed to, and took care of what needed to be done, but it was our hosts in each city and in each community who took over, and I'm sure they were very grateful, and so were we. So what were some of the questions they asked? Because we brought to them not only information, but I found out later a style of bringing information that they were not used to. If any of you who know me, and I know I have a lot of friends in the audience, I don't like to make speeches, but I do like to interact with people, and so do the others, Arnold and Bob. And so we would spend a few minutes making a presentation and showing the slides. They needed to do that. And then immediately we'd say, what are your questions? And at first they were very shy, because that's a part of the dialogue that they're not used to. They just really want the experts to come and tell them what to do and then to leave. And so our very style was what I think we left them more with than the information we gave them. So they finally asked us questions, and I might say that this was mainly in simultaneous translation. There's wonderful translators who can speak as fast as I can in Thai, and then of course speak again in English to us when they were speaking to us in Thai. How do you quantify the value of trees and open space? They wanted to know. Well, how do you quantify that? We're still working on that. They had an experience where, guess what? The central government had cut down all the trees to widen a highway. Nothing that we're ever experienced here, right? Anyone who remembers McLaughlin Boulevard in its early days, about 10 years ago, we had marvelous sequoia trees too. But how do you quantify that? Because they were saying if we cannot quantify the quality of these trees and what they give to us, we can't really convince the government to save them. How do you get people to voluntarily change behavior? They were just taken with our whole conservation ethic and our recycling and all those things. How do you get people to do it when the government doesn't make you do it? They also had some misinformation, and this was kind of interesting. Someone got up and said, well, I've been reading, Portland is the largest automotive port in the West. And of course, he was right, we are. And then his question, don't the auto industries oppose pollution control, and aren't they a big force or a big lobbying? Well, of course, the second part of that answer is yes, we import cars, but they leave as quickly as they come, and so really we don't have the auto industry as a force here. But that was the way he had assumed it. And then really the trigger question, the question that was under everybody's mind, and that finally when we made friends, they asked, and they asked again and again, says, we have been spending decades trying to be like you. We were told the Western style, bigger is better. We need to grow. We need to, all the things that you are now saying that maybe you're looking at for a second time. And if we're 40 or 50 years behind you, how can we catch up? So those were the issues that we heard in our whirlwind trip. Can't speak enough for the Thai people, the politeness and the warmth that they greeted us with, but also the fact that they are struggling with all these problems. And the good news, of course, is that they are struggling with them. We just came back from San Francisco, and there on the front pages of the Chronicle is a story that today 50 groups in San Francisco are calling themselves the Coalition for Smart Growth. And they're wrestling with all the examples and all the problems we have, and guess what? They are asking Portland, that spinster of the West, for the answers. Thank you.
Oops, that's the wrong one.
if you'll excuse me taking a page from Seattle, I would say that people in the Northwest here are very good salesmen to begin with, because I remember a line from some musical I heard during my youth, I don't know, Seven Brides for Seven Brothers or something, that has a song about the bluest skies you'll ever see are in Seattle. And having been in the Pacific Northwest now for the last 4 days, and I haven't seen a lot of blue sky, certainly not in Portland since I've been here, so you people should all do very well in the in the business field, I would think. I've been asked to talk about environmental issues in Southeast Asia and their implications for the U.S. I think in the summary I sent in to the City Club office, I said that the financial crisis and the environmental crisis are a little bit similar in that the financial crisis, the largest cause of that was essentially that companies and countries built and built and borrowed without thinking about how and when they would repay all the loans they took out. And essentially that's what's happened in Southeast Asia, much of Asia in general, in the environmental field. People have borrowed and borrowed against their natural resources, polluting their cities, cutting down their forests, and accumulating an enormous debt in terms of environmental degradation without ever thinking of how they were going to pay back that debt. The economic crisis that now exists has in some ways spotlighted those problems and perhaps given them an opportunity to rest and think about how they move ahead, whether they move ahead on the old rapid growth, no thinking about the environment plan, or whether they try and seek a somewhat more sustainable path. The economic crisis so far has had both good and bad effects on the environment in that part of the world. From the good side, just the simple fact that the economies have fallen so badly. GDP fell about 8% in a year in Thailand, and about the same or worse in Malaysia and Indonesia. That meant people's cars were repossessed because they couldn't pay the loans. Factories shut down. Construction, which was incredible in Southeast Asia. Everywhere you looked, there were condos and office buildings being built. Well, there's no one filling those buildings yet, and that construction has stopped. So the three main sources of air pollution in that part of the world have dried up to a large extent. Or I don't say dried up, but certainly decreased. So air pollution is down substantially in Bangkok and Kuala Lumpur and other cities. Perhaps not such that someone who had not been there before would think that air pollution was improved, but those of us who do stay there see it. The same thing has gone with traffic. Traffic is down substantially. Some of the grandiose economic plans that people have had that could have had major environmental impacts are being reconsidered. There are a number of mammoth hydroelectric dam projects being considered all around Southeast Asia. With economic growth slowing, so has demand for electricity, and now people are scaling back or even considering completely doing away with some of those projects. One of the concerns that many people have had about the economic crisis is that it would force people who were desperate, and all of these countries have been desperate to increase their exports, that it would cause them to push more into natural resources, to cut down more forests, to hunt more endangered species for to sell them abroad, to cut corners on the economy, cut corners in industry. Some of that has not happened, not because the impetus wasn't there, but because some of their main markets, particularly Japan, China, Taiwan, Korea, and those are particularly for things like forestry products and wildlife products, because those economies slowed or went into actual recession at the same time. So, in fact, that has not been a major impact of the economic crisis. But that problem will reemerge when the economies of Japan and Korea turn around, when China resumes a more robust growth path. So these sort of problems, and for that matter, when the countries of this region in general, the other problems, air pollution, water pollution, when they resume their growth, as they will still have to wrestle with those problems again. So what are the major environmental problems in Southeast Asia? I think I've already covered the urban problems again. Massive, uncontrolled growth, very, very bad air pollution from traffic, from industry, from construction. You also have major waste problems. These cities are all generating much more waste than they know what to do with, and they don't know what to do with it. They don't know where to put it. You have a lot of people that simply don't want it in their backyard. There's a major hazardous waste problem in most of these countries. You don't have the facilities for hazardous waste processing. And even where they do have some facilities, most companies don't know, and often don't care to use them because they're much more expensive. And the laws and the regulations may, in some cases, be in place, but the enforcement is poor. And the enforcement has decreased because of budget cuts during the economic crisis. Deforestation is a major, major problem in Southeast Asia, particularly in countries like Thailand and Vietnam that have large populations. And in those countries, forest cover Philippines as well, forest cover is 25%, 20%, even less than that. And one of the biggest problems for forests in that part of the world is that you have a situation in mainland Southeast Asia, in Indochina, where you have two large and, until recently, rapidly growing economies in Vietnam and Thailand. So large, growing, but resource poor, natural forest resource poor countries. And next to them you have three countries, Burma, Laos, and Cambodia, that are much smaller, well, Laos and Cambodia anyhow, much smaller in population, very rich in forest resources, and very poor in enforcement capacities. So essentially you've had the companies and countries on the two sides eating away at the forest resources of Laos and Cambodia. The future problem is China. Because of their own experience with devastating floods last year caused largely by deforestation in watershed areas, they have closed down logging in the major logging parts of China. That is good for them domestically. The same thing has happened largely in Thailand and Vietnam. However, what that means is that they have much larger import demand. I've heard estimates that China's import demand for timber products will increase fourfold as a result of their logging ban. That puts much more pressure on the existing natural resources of Laos, Cambodia, Burma, and of course Malaysia and Indonesia further south, which have still substantial timber reserves. Wildlife trade is a major problem as well, the illegal wildlife trade. And the major consumers there are Northeast Asia, China, Taiwan, Korea, Japan. that use products for traditional medicine, for jewelry, for trophies, and that is where what is left of Southeast Asia's wildlife is going. It goes from Laos and Cambodia out through Thailand or Vietnam and up to the markets in China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan. And you have a combination of weak enforcement capability and simple corruption and poor people that need to have something to live on. And that's a very difficult process to overcome. The situation is not that much better on the marine side. In all of Southeast Asia, you have a major problem with overfishing in the coastal areas. There are simply too many boats chasing too few fish. You have a big pollution problem in many of the coastal areas from water that wash from pollutants, both industrial chemicals and agricultural chemicals that flow down in the rivers, down to the ocean, down to the sea. And that is badly damaging coral reefs in most of Southeast Asia. In places like the Gulf Coast of Thailand, there are virtually no decent coral reefs left, and you have increasing problems in other areas. However, as I said earlier, there is an indication, at least, a possibility that people will take this economic crisis as an opportunity to rethink the problems and to see about how they can reach a more sustainable path of development. I cannot say at the moment how far that's going to proceed. I do know that it is not something that will happen on its own. It is not something that all of these countries will be able to do on their own, both because they don't have the expertise, they don't have the capital in some cases, and because in many cases they do not see the economic benefits. They are not always going to make the right choices unless they are given some more resources, some more pointers on how to move ahead. And but I'd like to move a little bit into the sort of more global implications of the environmental crisis there. The most obvious, I think, is probably the whole issue of climate change. And this is a major controversy between the US and the developed world and developing countries in Southeast Asia. Most of the countries in Southeast Asia, they look at the US and Europe and they say, those gases, the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, are there because you put them there. Your per capita consumption, our per capita consumption of carbon-based fuels is far, far higher than those existing in the third world. And so when people, for example, in our Senate, in the US Senate, I think before the Kyoto meeting on climate change in late 1997, the US Senate issued a resolution, I guess, that said, we will not sign on to the Kyoto Protocol unless third world countries sign up for exactly the same emissions reductions that we sign up for. And what you hear in that part of the world is that is simply a non-starter. That will not happen. And they will argue that should not happen morally, economically, that those economies continue to need to grow to bring their people further along the economic development path. So that is a major hurdle we have to face if we want to move ahead on climate change and greenhouse gas problems. Trade and environment in general is a very thorny issue for the U.S. and Southeast Asia. Countries there see issues like trade sanctions put on shrimp exports unless countries use devices that help protect sea turtles from getting caught, or a recent controversy about tuna and dolphin, or discussion about issues like timber certification to see whether timber comes from sustainably developed sources. They see these as disguised protectionism. They say, again, you have despoiled your environment and built your economy doing that. And now you are turning around and saying to us, we cannot do the same. So that is an issue we have to deal with every day in that part of the world. We need the support and the involvement of countries in Southeast Asia and throughout the developing world on issues like chemicals trade. Some of you may know the Montreal Protocols that dealt with reduction and finally phasing out of use of chlorofluorocarbons. There are similar international negotiations going on now on the use of, or some that were just completed and some that are continuing, on the use of various particularly dangerous and persistent chemicals, things like DDT, that are still used in many places around the world. And we, again, have to fight both sides of that battle, where we have to prove our point that there is a reason to phase these things out, and have to deal with the arguments from third world countries that, yes, again, you use these things to get up to this point. Now you're asking that we do not. On biodiversity issues, we are one of the two large countries in the world, Thailand being the other, that have not yet ratified the Convention on Biodiversity, which deals with things like access to genetic resources, plant and animal genetic resources for research purposes, for pharmaceuticals, for a variety of research and development purposes. More importantly, well, perhaps not more importantly, but more immediately relevant, is something called the Biosafety Protocol, which are negotiations that were suspended in a couple of months back in Cartagena, Colombia, which would cover trade in genetically modified organisms. And that is a big, big, big issue for the United States right now, because many of our agricultural exports are now genetically modified. Virtually all of our soybeans, a good percentage, I think, of our corn coming up, cotton. So this could have major implications for U.S. exports. But it comes under the Convention on Biodiversity. Because we are not a member of the convention, we cannot officially negotiate on the protocol, where some suggestions have been made to do things like simply bar all trade in genetically modified organisms between members and non-members of the Convention on Biodiversity. Countries in Southeast Asia are on both sides of this issue, even domestically. NGOs and consumer groups are often concerned and saying, what impact will genetically modified organisms have on our environment? Businesses and governments see the plus side. They see these as an avenue for further development in their own countries, particularly in more advanced scientific communities like Thailand and Malaysia and Singapore. So that will be an issue that we need to continue to engage these countries on, both to protect our own exports and to seek more sustainable development in that part of the world. What does that mean for you people sitting in this room today, for Oregon or Portland in general? Or Portland and Oregon in general, I guess. I think the most important thing it means, the most important role, and this is something that perhaps is not so strange to you, is that we need to support a U.S. role in the international arena. Withdrawing back into ourselves is not going to solve any of these problems. And as you know very well in the Pacific Northwest, our economy is more and more dependent on exports to Asia, for example. So we have to deal with these problems. Environmental problems like climate change will not go away. They're problems that are building up in our atmosphere, in our soil, and hiding our heads in that soil will not solve the problem either. Supporting a U.S. role means supporting budgets for our foreign affairs agencies, particularly for my agency. It means supporting U.S. foreign assistance and U.S. financial, the U.S. financial role in organizations like the UN and the IMF and the World Bank. And again, I perhaps don't need to say this to you as much as perhaps to other audiences around the country, but people think these are large, large sums of money we're spending overseas. They're not. If you take our State Department budget and our foreign assistance budget and put them all together, that's perhaps around $20 billion out of a U.S. government budget of around $1 billion, I guess. I actually don't know what the numbers are at this point, but it's pretty darn small. Sorry, $1 trillion, not $1 billion. Right. So those funds have an enormous leverage capability, and we need to support them. We should support the Climate Change Convention. I know that Portland, unlike many cities, many communities in the U.S., actually has a climate change strategy, I believe, of some sort. That puts you a long way ahead of most other places in the U.S. But there's still an awful lot of opposition. And they're for both good reasons and bad. Obviously, cutting down our greenhouse gas emissions has enormous implications for our economy, but the long run implications are good. And so it's important for us to support that. It's important for you to let your representatives know that, if indeed you feel that's the case, and I think because you have a city climate change strategy, that is the case. I mentioned earlier the Convention on Biodiversity. We cannot be a player if we're not in the game. And right now we are not in the game. We don't have a vote. And there are important decisions being made there that affect the world's environment, affect U.S. exports. We need to be in the game. Let your elected representatives know that as well. I think it's important to be, all of you, to be informed consumers. You can help make people cleaner producers. I know that, for example, one Oregon company, Nike, has been working very hard on greener and cleaner production standards. They've done a lot of work out in Southeast Asia. And I think those sort of efforts come because of community pressure. And I think there's an awful lot of other efforts going on, as I said before, on timber, on fish, on endangered species issues. But the important thing there also is be an informed consumer. Some of the campaigns that come out there don't always think their strategies through, don't always think through the implications. On some of our NGO campaigns that sometimes become government campaigns, we're using an awful lot of sticks and not too many carrots. And we have to remember that these people need to live too. We have to find a way that equates development and environment, sustainable development, not just saying our concerns for the environment will come first over your development, and therefore we will have sanctions on this and this and this and this and this until you make that sustainably managed. We have to phase sanctions in if we feel they're necessary. We have to explain. We have to give assistance where necessary. We need to understand where other people are coming from. I think that there is hope for Southeast Asia. The people out there that I have dealt with are well educated. They often know many of these environmental issues better than I do, which is not necessarily saying a great deal, but it's not usually the case in other parts of the world. There are extraordinarily committed people, committed to the environment, committed to economic growth as well. Sometimes they're the same people, sometimes they're not. There are a lot of problems. They are not insurmountable. I think we have a role as the US government through aid, through investment, through technical assistance, environmental technologies, in which we have a comparative advantage. Sometimes a lot of these people can pay for them. Sometimes they cannot be paid for. And that's where the aid role comes in. But I think that we can help these countries pursue a more sustainable path. But again, we have to go out there to work with them, not tell them what to do, not use so many sticks and use a few more carrots. But we need to stay engaged, both because it's important for them, it's important for us and our exports, and it's important for the world's environment. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank Elaine and James today for our intriguing and very serious presentation. I must admit, thinking back when I drive back to Marylhurst University, I'm wondering, students, how do we actually engage our students to learn and stay on top of these issues with clearing the air?
Well, I think it's merely really to give them the time and the information, because the young people, even the young people today who we're thinking is that the X generation you're dealing with? Those who, quote, don't care as much. Those are Eric Stan's generation. Eric, for Jim's benefit, is our newest city commissioner. I think he's 30. But he's certainly not much more than that. And there's a whole coterie of people like that. I think they just merely need the information and the time. So I would hope that you don't overstrain them at Merrillhurst, so they do have a little bit of both.
One of the things I've been struck with, particularly as I sit in Bangkok, but in theory cover something like 15 different countries, and I cannot travel to them all the time, is the enormous amount of information that you can find on the internet. Not just in the United States. Almost every country around the world, well, all the countries that I deal with anyhow, have at least a couple of internet sites. In some cases, dozens, even hundreds. Government agencies, NGOs, businesses have information on the internet about environmental issues, on natural issues, for example. You have a wealth of information from organizations like the Worldwide Fund for Nature, the World Wildlife Fund in the U.S., or the World Conservation Union, IUCN. And since kids, love to play on computers so much to begin with, I think that's a good place to try and point them in directions like that. It's a good way to learn about the world in general.
Jim, you need to tell them what an NGO is. We learned.
Oh, sorry, non-governmental organization.
Okay.
John Wool, City Club member. One factor in all the growth problems is the population. Are they doing enough in those areas on family planning? Is family access to family planning sufficient?
I don't know.
Actually, it depends on the country. In Thailand, they have had a quite successful population control program that was funded in large part through USAID. In other countries, you have mixed records. It depends a lot on the society. It's more difficult, for example, in Indonesia, which is a Muslim society, than it is in some of the other countries. But I think generally in more developed Southeast Asia, anyhow, it is much less of a problem than it is in the poorest countries, as you find anywhere else in the world. You have less of a problem in Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, than you have in places like Laos and Cambodia.
Bob Wheel, City Club member. Elaine, my question is for you. I have great respect for your outstanding analysis of Oregon politics, so appreciate your comment on the following. The Oregon legislature is about to pass, may even have passed already, a bill which forbids the state or any state agency to pass any rules or regulations to implement the Kyoto Conference or to do anything to control greenhouse gas emissions. Would you comment?
I've only been gone 10 days. Unbelievable. Well, I think it's, first of all, it's silly. It's silly politics, and I don't know how the state can mandate what the federal what is done on the federal level. So my guess is it's something that we would wish they wouldn't do, but there are other things that I would get excited about because I don't think it's going to go anywhere. But I have to say that they slipped it by me because I haven't heard it. I mean, so it must have just happened within the last 10 days.
Susan Stone, member of the club. Mr. Martin, I kind of wanted to crawl under my chair given the extreme bleakness of your presentation. I was wondering, could you give us a snapshot of what you think Southeast Asia will look like in 10 years? Elaine, we'd love to hear from you too, if you.
I can certainly tell you one thing, that it will take at least 5 years from an economic standpoint to fill the office and residential condominium construction that has been done up to this point in Thailand. That's how badly overbuilt they are. I would guess from an economic standpoint that they will probably have gotten back most of those countries to economic growth of between 3% and 5% a year in 10 years. I think that from an environmental standpoint, I think the pollution situation will be improved in places like Thailand and Malaysia, possibly the Philippines. It will be worse in places like Vietnam. I think some of the natural resource issues will, again, you'll see a mixed picture. It won't be the same everywhere. I think that the countries that are moving ahead will have made, have grown more to this point, will have taken some steps to solve some of the environmental problems. They won't have solved them, but I think the situation in Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, well, I don't know about Indonesia, will be better than it is now. But I think in other countries, like the countries that are still further down the totem pole economic growth-wise, it will probably be worse.
I'll just add a little bit from the Thailand perspective. It was very interesting hearing you speak of the government, and the government, you mainly speak government to government, U.S. too. And of course, they are saying that line is, why can't we go through the same pollution and problems that you did? I mean, you did it, and now you've seen the light, and you have to let us do it. Now, however, the people we met, and these were leaders, now a handful. I mean, we have to make sure that we put it in perspective. If we met 100 people, 200, we met a lot. But they are leaders in their communities. And they were saying, can't we leap over that problem that you have now found solutions for or are working towards, a whole sustainable communities, and how can we do it? Now, in their countries, it is not as easy as we can do it here. But what we saw were the glimmers of, first of all, asking the question, and then the NGO, they're nonprofits, they're called NGOs, but how can the NGOs make a difference? In other words, how can the non-governmental bodies make a difference? How can the universities make a difference? And we met with people from 2 major universities there. And our answer, again, not prescribing, because I want to be so careful, but to say, well, try your neighborhoods, try your university, environment. Don't take on the world or even the city. And so I found that there was hope in the fact that there were some citizens aware that they don't have to repeat all the terrible things we have gone through in order to go through the fire and then see the light at the other end.
Yeah, just follow up on that briefly, is that one of the things that you see that the most important signs of hope are community participation. In the countries that have more open societies like Thailand and the Philippines, you have really substantial community participation, really substantial NGO environmental movements that are having an impact on government policies. Obviously, countries that do not have open societies like Vietnam, Laos, and places like that, it is considerably more difficult to have that sort of impact.
Thank you.
I'm Ray Polani, a City Club member. I think you all touched on the what's happening there, primarily this rush to reach our consumption level and Western Europe's consumption level to some degree. We bear a tremendous responsibility, I think, because in this global communication era, we have set the example, and obviously they want to imitate it. I suspect, and Mr. Martin, you touched on that, our not signing up on several protocols that would call for a reduction of our overconsumption in many places and reining back and so on. When do you think that there is a likely possibility that we will change ourselves, and maybe to some degree Western Europe too, so that we can reduce our impact and they can follow our example in that direction?
On, for example, the Convention on Biodiversity, it's really not a very difficult issue, and I expect that probably it's just being held up by little political infighting within the Senate. I am frankly very pessimistic about the chances of the U.S. ever ratifying the Kyoto Protocol, frankly. Certainly I don't see it happening with a Senate that looks anything like the one that we have now. Western Europe actually has taken considerably larger strides in that regard. Of course, it's been easier for them because their economies have not been growing the way ours is. So it's a difficult, very difficult issue.
My name is Sharon Joy, City Club member. First, I want to comment. My brother has had very good relationships with the King of Thailand in the line of he's doing now a medical and dental program completely based upon what he wants. But anyway, so he's real pleased with the man. But what I don't understand is you say that Thailand is definitely more advanced, say, than Laos and Cambodia, and yet the environmental features, such as the trees in Laos and Cambodia, are better than in Thailand. Can you explain why, where there are a population control and so forth, in a progressive place, that the environment is deteriorating in comparison?
Well, the basic issues there are population and economic growth. Thailand has a large population relative to its land mass and has had high economic growth rates that were, the economy, at least initially, was built on exploiting natural resources such as timber. A lot of forest land was cut down for rice fields and that sort of thing. Laos and Cambodia have much smaller populations, much lower rates of economic growth, and so they have not gotten to a lot of their natural resources up to this point. They were always sort of more bush countries than Thailand. Also, there are some residues there. Cambodia, for example, has had a civil war for much of the last 20 years, and people didn't go into forest areas because they were held by the rebels. In Laos, a lot of the forest areas still have unexploded ordnance from the Vietnam War. So there are other factors that impinge on that.
Thank you.
It's not a matter of the countries being more environmentally conscious. They're considerably less environmentally conscious.